Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I am Evelyn Hart, 68, and the afternoon my son and daughter-in-law left me at Dallas-Fort Worth with a one-way ticket and my tote lifted for their priority check-in. I saved her first-class story like a receipt reached into the $960 Arthur and I kept for break glass days and called my attorney. Before dark, I spoke one clean sentence under a notary seal. I crossed them out of my will. Months later, certified letters landed 16 missed calls stacked up, and an email begged to keep a garden I had already given to Elder Harbor. This is not rage. It is a boundary that holds told in paper and quiet choices. If you want to see how dignity writes its own ending, start here. I reached Dallas-Fort Worth in the late afternoon that hour when rolling suitcases hum like a beehive and the air smells like coffee and warm pretzels. Ben and his wife had sold the trip as a small family getaway to help me breathe after Arthur's funeral. I carried a printed itinerary Ben forwarded from his account my ID and a small tote with a cardigan and a paperback. At the counter, the agent asked for my documents and began the gentle tapping that usually ends in a smile. Her expression changed. She told me there was a one-way ticket for me to Orlando and no return booked in my name. She angled her monitor and I saw my name and birthday and the empty field where a return should live. I pointed toward Ben and Lena a few steps away and said there had to be a mistake. Ben kept his eyes on his phone the way people watch the weather. Lena balanced a glossy suitcase with a priority tag and said I might want to stay longer and rest. She gave the word easier a tidy weight. Before I could gather myself, she lifted my small tote from the top of my roller and pushed it toward the curbside station, telling the skycap we were checking together. The smallest things become tethers when you are exposed in a public place. That tote held my reading glasses and a tin of mints and a paperback with a bent corner. Suddenly the tether was gone. They drifted into the priority lane like practiced travelers and were absorbed by the glass and steel of the security line. No turn of the head. No hand lifted. The announcements rolled across the ceiling and down the concourse. Final boarding for other lives. I stepped aside so the line could move and opened my wallet. A few bills, a debit card. A credit card I had not used since Arthur went into the hospital. I could buy a sandwich and a cup of tea. I could not buy a last-minute fare home or a night in the hotel whose windows were catching the sun across the roadway. With no money meant exactly that in this bright light. I did not have what it would take to get myself home that day. My phone buzzed. Lena's story lit the screen. A bright square with the words "Priority and First Class" layered over a picture of crossed ankles and a plastic cup of orange juice. The location pin read DFW. I took a screenshot. My hand shook, so I took another. I saved both and locked the screen. I walked to a bench beside the windows and sat with my back straight so I would not fold in on myself. The runway lay in long bands of late light. A plane lifted and vanished into glare, then another. Grief rearranges sound. It takes the ordinary and turns it into remembrance. I heard Arthur trying to whistle along with jet engines the last time we flew to see the ocean. In 2019, after his heart scare, we made a small plan for the day the floor might tilt. We put together an envelope and called it our break glass fund. Not a treat, not a toy, a handhold for a bad day. I touched the inside pocket of my coat and felt the edge of paper. $960. Enough for a cab across town and a clean room if I needed it. Not enough to buy back a promise or a return ticket in a rush. Not enough to make me someone's first choice again. I let the bench cool my hands and measured my breath until the pressure in my ears eased. I thought about who to call. My sister has been gone for years. The women I know from church and the community center have their own grown children and their own quiet storms. I did not want to speak a sentence that began with "can you" and ended with "I am sorry to ask." I opened my contacts and scrolled past names that have not lit up in months past Arthur's number. I still cannot bring myself to delete to the W section. J.R. Wheeler. Arthur used to say that if the world turns sideways, we call J.R. I pressed the call button. While it rang, I pictured the carpet under J.R.'s chair and the stack of manila folders with neat tabs and the way he slides his glasses down when he is about to say something that matters. He answered, and I did not tell the long story. I told him I needed to update my will. I told him I would cross out my son and my daughter-in-law. He asked where I was. I told him. He said to come now and that Nina would set the papers. I ended the call and sat one more minute to be sure my legs were ready. The agent who had helped me glanced over with a question in her eyes. I lifted a hand to say I was fine. That was not exactly true, and also the truest thing I could offer. I would be fine because I would act. I stood and walked to the curb where cabs idle in a line that never seems to shorten. The air smelled like exhaust and fryer oil from the food court. The wind found the place at the base of my neck where sorrow likes to live. I thought of Ben when he was small green stains on his knees after soccer practice the day he cupped a toad and asked to keep it, and I told him some things belong to the world. I thought of the first night Lena came to dinner and I set the table with our wedding china because I wanted her to feel welcome. I thought of how this getaway had been sold as air for my lungs and how I had not noticed the price rising. A cab pulled up. The driver leaned to unlock the back door and asked for my destination. Wheeler and Givens in Plano, I said. He nodded and turned on the meter. I settled into the seat and slid my hand into my coat for the envelope. I counted the fare in my head, added a tip, and tucked the rest away. As we pulled from the curb, the terminal shrank in the side mirror to a ribbon of glass. The sky over the runways burned orange and then softened toward pink. I watched the color shift and matched my breathing to the rhythm of the tires. The driver turned on a radio station that played piano and strings nothing familiar, a steady kind of calm that did not demand anything from me. I opened my phone and looked at the screenshots again. I cropped one so the location tag sat clean in the frame. I opened my notes and wrote the date and time and the terminal and the words one-way ticket. I wrote the name of the agent in case I needed it, the counter number, the last four of the confirmation. I added the sum in the envelope and the simple plan for the next hours. Drive to the firm, sit with JR, sign what needs signing, store what needs storing, close what needs closing. Outside the window, the freeway opened in long, clear lanes, and the city slid past in a wash of billboards and sound walls and low winter grass. I pressed my palm against my coat pocket and felt the crisp paper there. I repeated the sentence I had told JR, not a threat and not a plea. I will cross them out of my will. It did not feel like cruelty. It felt like finding the right key on a ring and turning it until the tumblers settled into place. The shape of the decision fit my hand. The driver asked if the air was too cold, and I told him it was fine. For a mile, I thought of the front door of my house and the way the lock sticks after a storm of the chair where Arthur set his book face down with the pages fanned like a bird tail. I let those pictures drift, and then I let them go. When the low line of Plano rose out of the haze, the driver signaled and took the exit. The lights of Wheeler and Givens came into view, steady and ordinary, the way a lighthouse is ordinary until you need it. The car slowed. I smoothed my coat, felt the envelope one more time, and watched the curve draw closer. I could feel the hollow place inside me steadying, not full yet, but firm enough to hold a pen. The cab door closed with a soft, hollow sound, and the driver asked where to go. I told him Wheeler and Givens in Plano, and he nodded and set the meter. We slid into the slow river of cars, looping the terminals past pillars that threw long afternoon shadows across lanes of painted arrows. The airport fell behind in the glass of the side window, and the radio found a station with piano that did not ask for attention. I kept my hands folded so my knees would not shake, and pressed my wrist once against the inside pocket of my coat to feel the edge of the envelope. The driver checked his mirror and asked if I needed to turn back for anything I forgot. I told him no, straight to the firm thank you. He said all right, and merged onto the freeway where the lanes opened like ribbons pulled flat. Late sun turned taillights into a string of red beads. The hum of tires was steady enough to hold me in place. I opened my phone to be sure I had saved what I saw at the terminal. The story square with the word priority, the plastic cup of orange juice, the location pin that read DVATW. I saved the screenshot to a folder and wrote the time in my notes with the gate number and the agent's name spelled the way it was on her badge. I typed a line that steadied me what is trusted must have paperwork. The words felt like a railing in a stairwell. I could hold on and climb. The freeway straightened and the white noise softened. Memory stepped forward without knocking. In 2019, Arthur had a spell in the kitchen where his hand went slack on the coffee mug and the color left his face. I stood in a hospital hall that smelled like bleach while a nurse asked me for a list of medicines and allergies, and I could not remember the names on the bottles in our bathroom. He came home with new pills and a sheet for the refrigerator and an instruction to take life in smaller bites. That afternoon, he sat at the dining table with a stack of 20s and said we would make a small safety rope. We called it a break glass fund and tucked the envelope behind the winter scarves. We put it there for a day when the floor might slide. It was not a treat. It was not a toy. It was a promise that we would not wait for a rescue if we could reach the shore on our own. The cab rolled under an overpass and the light flickered across the dashboard. I rested my head against the seat and watched the curve of the ramp glide by. January had come with lilies and paper plates and voices that filled the rooms, and then ebbed so quickly the house felt larger than it had any right to feel. After the last casserole, quiet arrived with a weight. I counted the slow circles of the ceiling fan the way people count breaths. The mailbox still snapped shut when I closed it. The water still ran clear. I told myself those were proof that moving forward was possible. Ben came by twice that month in a jacket with his company logo on the chest, sitting at the edge of the couch as if he might be called back to a meeting. He said he and the kids and Lena were planning a spring break trip to Orlando, and that I should come so I could get sun on my shoulders instead of the lamp over the sink. He said everyone would chip in, and that his account could bundle the tickets. I said that sounded kind. I did not ask for receipts. I did not want to turn kindness into arithmetic. I put the jewelry box in the closet because my hands were not ready for small decisions. I chose to believe I was included, and that belief would be enough. The driver asked if the air was too cold. I told him it was fine, and he said to tell him if I wanted water and that he could stop by a station near the exit. I thanked him, and he left me to the view. The city along the freeway slid past in a wash of billboards and sound walls and brown winter grass. I opened my photos and checked that the screenshots had backed up to the cloud. Then I opened the banking app, took in the numbers I already knew, and closed it. The envelope in my pocket was not for comfort. It was a bridge from a public hurt to a door with my name on it. Small signs had collected in the months between the funeral and the airport. Calls that ended after 2 minutes because someone had to jump to another line. Group pictures where I stood at the edge, and later on social media the square crop started 3 inches to the right, and my shoulder became the border. Posts about family time that named the dog and the side dish and the flight number, but not the woman who baked the rolls. None of it a crime. Enough of it to teach a person her place. The cab passed a billboard with a smiling family in matching shirts, and I pressed a hand to the small hollow under my ribs, the way you do with a stitch after too much walking. I let the breath in and out without talking to it. The driver glanced up again and asked one more time if I wanted to return to the terminal for anything. I told him no, and that the firm was the only stop. He nodded and said all right. The freeway lifted over a creek that looks like steel in winter. A freight train moved on a parallel track, and the steady low rumble filled the cab with the feeling of distance. I let the sound pass through me like weather. I thought of the first dinner where we hosted Lena when Ben had just brought her home. I set the good plates because I wanted her to feel like a guest of honor. She posted a picture of the table and wrote about the meal and the tribe and gratitude. My hands were in the frame at the edge, passing the basket. Later, she laughed about how her followers liked the china, and she asked where I got it, and I told her it was a wedding gift from a time when people bought plates one at a time and wrapped them in tissue. She said that was sweet. She did not ask me what the pattern was called. The light lowered toward the buildings and made even the grocery stores look brave. I checked the time. I counted the likely forms: identification, a list of assets, a change of beneficiary, an appointment of an independent executor so that the work would not become a family argument. I pictured JR sliding his glasses down and asking the calm questions that sort feeling from fact. I pictured Nina with a neat stack of papers and a pen that clicked softly. I pictured a notary seal pressing down and the paper lifting a little under the stamp. These images did not scare me. They made my breath even. My phone buzzed, and for a second I thought it would be Ben. It was not. It was a promotional mailer from the airline, promising flexible options. I deleted it and opened my notes again and added a list for the hour ahead. Call Carla at the bank about a safe deposit box. Ask JR about POD and TOD on accounts. Scan signed documents to the encrypted folder. Keep explanations in writing. Let letters do the talking. I read the lines twice and put the phone away. We left the freeway and moved through a grid of low office parks where the grass by the sidewalks is trimmed tight even in late winter. The cab slowed at a light, and in the window I saw a faint reflection of a woman with white hair pulled back, and a face that looks like mine and my mother's at the same time. I lifted my chin a little and adjusted my collar the way she did when she was about to enter a room where people might ask for something she did not have to give. The driver pointed with 2 fingers at a small brick complex with dark windows and a simple directory sign. Wheeler and Givens sat in black letters on a plaque that did not try to impress anyone. "Is this it?" he asked, and I said yes. The meter clicked up one last $1. He pulled to the curb and shifted into park and asked if I needed a receipt. I said I did, and he printed one and handed it back through the gap between the seats. Paper against paper in my wallet made a small comfort. I counted out the fare from the envelope and added a tip that felt fair. "Thank you," I said, and he nodded and told me good luck. in the voice of someone who has driven strangers to courts and hospitals and interviews and knows when silence is the best company. The air outside carried the plain smell of cut grass and copier toner. The glass doors held a narrow slice of sky. I stood for a heartbeat with my hand at my side and let the noise from the road fade. My hands were empty, and that would be fine for this part. Inside the lobby, a plant stood next to a couch covered in fabric meant to hide where. A directory listed names in a clean column with Wheeler and Givens on the second floor. I pressed the elevator button and watched it light. Somewhere above a bell sounded and the cables answered. I checked the envelope once more and felt the crisp edges through the cloth and let my hand fall. When the doors opened, I stepped in and faced the numbers and felt the lift begin its slow climb. The elevator opened on a quiet hallway with pale wood and a brass plaque that read, Wheeler and Givens. I pushed through the glass door into a reception area with framed prairie prints. A woman with a neat bun stood as if she had been waiting. She said her name was Nina Cole from the firm and asked if I had identification. I handed her my license and the slim folder I had kept since Arthur passed. She led me into a conference room that smelled like paper and lemon and woke a small scanner with a gentle click. Nina took a yellow pad and said we would make a quick inventory so the documents would be exact. She confirmed my full name and address and the date of Arthur's death in January. She wrote house in Plano paid in full and looked up. I told her the deed was clear. She wrote duplex in McKinney used as a rental and asked for the address and manager. I gave both. She wrote retirement accounts at Fidelity, and I said there was an IRA from a rollover and a small Roth. She asked if the beneficiary forms reflected my current wishes. I told her they did not, and that was the reason I had come. She moved down the page and asked about certificates of deposit. I told her I held about $60,000 in CDs at 2 banks laddered so one matured each quarter. Life insurance, she said. I told her the policy amount was $150,000 and the beneficiary designation had not been updated since the first paperwork all those years ago. She circled it and said that after the will work we would update beneficiary forms because they pass outside probate when filed correctly. Vehicles. 1 car with a clear title. Personal items with special meaning. I said I would rather handle those by a letter of instruction than carve them into the will. She nodded and added, letter of instruction to the pad. The door opened and J.R. Wheeler came in with his glasses low on his nose and the calm I remembered from the day he helped Arthur and me with our first estate papers. He shook my hand and sat across the table. He said we would take this step by step, so it felt like walking and not falling. He asked to hear my intent in my own words. I told him I wanted my son Ben and his wife Lena removed from all authority and all benefit. I said I wanted Elder Harbor to receive the residue of my estate at death, and that any gifts during my lifetime would be modest and documented. I said I wanted an independent professional as executor so no one in the family would stand between my decisions and their effect. I told him I wanted clarity on paper because I was finished explaining my life in rooms where people talked over me. J.R. leaned back and took off his glasses. He said the law draws a clean line between a gift made during life and a bequest that takes effect at death. A donation while alive can be structured, so I keep control until conditions are met. A bequest passes through the estate according to the will and any designations that live beside the will. He said first we would set the will. Then we would align the rest so there is no contradiction. Payable on death at the bank, transfer on death at the brokerage. He said we would also prepare a letter of instruction for personal effects and practical wishes and keep that letter with the originals. Nina slid an intake summary across and JR read it in a steady cadence. House in Plano paid in full. Duplex in McKinney with no liens. IRA and Roth at Fidelity. CDs around $60,000. Life insurance at $150,000. One car. Personal property by letter. He asked whom I wished to name as executor. I said Samuel Price, age 58. A professional trust officer with no family tie to me. JR nodded at independence and said it keeps execution clean. He asked for Elder Harbor's legal name and status. Nina confirmed the nonprofit registration and address from her tablet. JR outlined the document the way a builder sketches a frame. This will revokes all prior wills. It appoints Samuel Price as independent executor with full authority under Texas law and without bond. It contains clear disinheritance language naming Benjamin Hart and Alina Ruiz Hart so no one can pretend ambiguity. It leaves the residue to Elder Harbor. Gifts during life will be handled separately by deed or simple gift letter. He said we would prepare letters for my banks and for Fidelity to update beneficiary forms and that Nina would track confirmations to completion. He recommended a visit to my bank this week to open a safe deposit box for originals, while the firm held another original in their fire safe. He asked if I had questions. I asked when this would stand. He said the will speaks at death, but once signed with witnesses and a notary, its existence is firm now. Beneficiary changes take effect when the institutions process them. He asked if I wanted any small gifts to individuals. Not at this time, I said, and I will return if I change my mind rather than write in margins. He smiled at the word margins and nodded to Nina. She stepped out and returned with a neat stack of pages and an ink pad with a fresh seal. She scanned my ID and set it back in a clear sleeve so it would not stray on the table. She placed a small tab where each signature would go and walked me through the headings. Last will and testament. Appointment of independent executor. Specific disinheritance. Residuary clause. Affidavit with witnesses. 2 staff members would witness at the end, so the affidavit carried its own proof. She asked if I wanted a moment. I said I was ready. JR asked that I read the disinheritance paragraph aloud, so everyone present would hear the exact words. I felt my breath steady. I read that I intentionally made no provision for my son Benjamin Hart or his wife Alina Ruiz Hart, and that this was a conscious and deliberate choice. The room felt very quiet and right. I read on until Elder Harbor appeared in black ink, and my chest loosened as if a knot had learned it was a bow. JR handed me a pen and asked me to sign exactly as my full name appears on my identification. I wrote Evelyn Marie Hart in careful letters. Nina brought in 2 staff members who signed with practiced economy. She set the notary pad, asked me to raise my right hand, and asked whether I signed willingly, whether I was of sound mind, and whether the document reflected my wishes. I answered yes to each. She pressed the seal. The paper rose under the stamp with a small click that sounded like a lock catching. JR tapped the edges of the signed pages square and slid an action list toward me. Bank visit for a safe deposit box. Beneficiary forms for Fidelity and the insurer. Notices to the property manager in McKinney so the executor appointment is on record. Draft of the letter of instruction for personal items. Nina would send secure electronic copies to a password-protected folder, while the firm kept an original until mine sat in the bank. We would avoid phone debates and let letters do the speaking so the air stayed clear. My hands were still on the table and they were not shaking. Nina offered water and I accepted. The cold drew a clean line through my throat and I felt my shoulders settle. I asked for an envelope for the copies. She brought one with the firm name in small black type. JR asked if I had a ride or needed a car. I told him the cab was waiting and I would go to the branch directly. He said if the banker needed confirmation, they would send it before close. We stood and the chairs made a soft scrape that marks the end of a meeting and the start of a plan. JR shook my hand and said everything from here would follow what the paper said. Nina walked me to the door. The hall outside had warmed in color. I tucked the envelope into my coat pocket and felt the new weight. The elevator bell sounded and the doors opened. I stepped in, faced the numbers, and let the car take me down toward the curb where the cab idled, and the next errand waited with a metal box that would learn my name. The cab waited at the curb while I pressed the firm envelope flat against my coat and gave the driver the branch address in Plano. We rode in a hush while late lights slid across windshields. At the Chase entrance, I asked him to wait. He tipped his cap and settled back. Inside the lobby, a banker approached before I reached the counter. Her nameplate read, Carla Nguyen. She had that steady look of someone who has seen every kind of day at a bank. I told her I needed to review every access point to accounts in my name, to revoke anything that was not strictly mine, and to open a safe deposit box for original documents. She asked for identification and led me into her glass office. The door closed with a soft click that kept the lobby noise outside. We sat at a small round table. She verified my profile step by step. Full legal name, address in Plano, phone number used for text alerts, email on file. I told her I would be changing the email after we finished. She nodded and said we would update the bank profile at the end, so only the new address would receive notices. She opened online banking and showed the list of devices with recent logins. I recognized my phone and laptop by their nicknames. 2 older devices still sat on the list from last year. No unknown devices showed. Carla recommended a fresh start anyway. We reset my password and turned on 2-factor authentication for every sign-in. I chose text codes to my phone and a printed list of backup codes sealed for the box. She printed the codes and slid them across the table in a small envelope. I read one code back to confirm it was legible and felt a small gap in my chest close. We moved to linked transfers and external payees. An old link to a joint household account remained. I still used that one, so we kept it. An external link for Ben from years ago still sat on the list. I asked her to remove it. She clicked and it vanished. Scheduled payments came next. There it was in clean letters. Recurring payment to Frisco Independent School District. Draft date later this month. I told her it had been set from my account and that it needed to stop. She asked if I wanted to delete the payee or only end the schedule. I told her to end the autopay and keep the payee so there would be a clear trail. She canceled the schedule and printed a confirmation with a reference number. I placed the page on top of the firm envelope. We reviewed debit and credit cards. No authorized users were listed. She asked if anyone else knew my online credentials. After today, the answer would be no. We set fraud alerts to text me when a charge over a chosen amount posted. I picked a modest threshold. She asked whether to limit cash withdrawals at ATMs. I said yes and named a cap that would keep me safe from my own bad day decisions. Next came alerts, balance warnings, large outgoing transfers, profile changes. We toggled on what mattered and left off the rest so my phone would not become a bell without meaning. I chose electronic statements only and told her I would print the monthly summary and place it in the box with other records. She smiled and said any future executor would thank me. I said that was the plan. Carla walked me to the vault hall to open a safe deposit box. The corridor was cooler and the sound softened to a felt hush. She brought out a small steel drawer and set it on the counter. We reviewed the rental terms in plain language. I signed the agreement, and she handed me 2 keys in a sleeve. The bank keeps a master, and my 2 keys must be used with theirs. She suggested I keep 1 key on a ring I carry and place the other with the firm until everything settles. I told her that matched my plan with Mr. Wheeler. We placed the firm envelope inside with the signed will and affidavits. I added the printed backup codes for 2-factor authentication and the confirmation page for the canceled school payment. The drawer slid home with a sound that felt like a decision catching. I had put something heavy down in the right place. Back in her office, Carla asked if I wanted to update the email on file. I gave her a new address no one in the family knew. She sent a verification message. My phone buzzed and I confirmed. She changed the profile and asked me to log out and in again with the new credentials to test the 2-factor. A code arrived. I entered it. The account opened clean and quiet. 2 messages landed in a row. Password changed. 2-factor authentication enabled. A 3rd followed. Recurring payment to Frisco Independent School District canceled. No drama, no noise, just a door closing in the way a good latch does. I let my shoulders drop and drew a steady breath. We spoke about credit freezes. Carla guided me through a freeze with the credit bureau using the bank portal and printed the PIN for my file. She asked if I needed travel notes on the account for unusual card activity. I told her my travel would be between the firm, the bank, and home. She nodded and said to call her directly if anything posted that looked wrong. I asked for a clean summary of accounts in my name with balances masked except for the last 2 digits. She generated the report and stamped it with the branch date. She clipped it to a blank set of beneficiary change letters that JR's office would send for me to sign when his team was ready. That way the stack would stay tidy. She gave me a moment to order my papers. I set the receipts in a simple stack. Firm copies, bank confirmations, backup codes, box agreement with key numbers. On top, I placed a note in my own hand with times. Reset credentials with 2-factor, removed external link for Ben, canceled school autopay, opened box and placed originals, updated email, turned on alerts. I took a photo of the note and saved it to a folder labeled Receipts 2025 Heart. Carla returned with her card and said she would watch for documents from the law firm and scan them to my profile the day they arrived. I thanked her and stood. She walked me to the lobby and held the door. Outside, the light had gone practical and flat, the kind that makes hedges look trimmed sharper than they are. The driver lifted his eyes as I approached. I told him we would stop back at the firm to leave 1 key with their file and then head home. He pulled from the curb and the bank drifted behind us into a line of tidy buildings. My phone buzzed once more with a profile update confirmation. Last button fastened. Coat closed. I rested the folder on my lap. It felt heavier by just the right amount. Somewhere in a vault, a narrow drawer held my name and a small stack of pages that would say what needed saying when I was not there to say it. JR would keep the twin original in his fire safe. Nina would send secure digital copies to the new address with a password only I knew. In my notes, I added one last line. Evidence kept. Access reclaimed. Next step to be calm. The driver asked if the air was all right. I said it was and watched the road gather itself into evening as we rolled toward the office where a second safe was waiting, and then toward a quiet house that would not echo in quite the same way. I left a spare key with JR's file, thanked Nina for the secure copies, and drove home with the firm envelope steady on the passenger seat. At the kitchen counter, I stood a moment with my hands flat on the cool stone, then called a small moving company out of McKinney that the property manager had recommended. The dispatcher sounded like a man who carries more than furniture. We set a Tuesday morning slot in the last week of March, 3 workers and a compact truck. I told him the list was short. He said they would be careful and on time. That evening I opened the windows an inch and let air slip through the rooms. I laid out packing paper on the dining table and wrote a list that was a plan, not a diary. Arthur's chair from the den, wedding album from the high shelf, a small row of books from the window case, the wooden box of Sunday letters, his navy cap, my mother's quilt. I let my hand hover over other things and then set the pen down before the list became a history. In the morning, I phoned the property manager the firm had engaged. Kelly moved through details with brisk kindness. The lockbox would hang at the back door under the carport. Only her office and the law firm would have the code. The house keys would go inside with a short checklist for meter readings and the lawn service contact. By midday, she texted a photo of the lockbox in place, and I replied with a photo of the thermostat set to a steady number and the water and gas valves set as agreed. Paper with pictures holds truth longer. I walked the rooms with an empty tote and gathered the few things I would hand carry. In the den, I touched the arms of Arthur's chair. The cushion had his shape like the memory of a breath. I tried the thought of leaving it. The thought did not hold. The chair would come. I reached for the wedding album and felt the weight of pages that have survived more than moves. I pulled 7 books from the shelf, not the best ones, the ones with his penciled check marks, and 1 margin note that just said, "Good." The quilt lay folded in the cedar chest and still smelled faintly of the closet at my mother's house. The navy cap fit the front hook as if it had been waiting for a trip. The truck pulled to the curb 5 minutes early. 3 men in clean work shirts stepped out with gloved hands and quiet eyes. The foreman walked the list with me and repeated it to his crew without adding questions. 2 straps under the chair, a careful lift, the album wrapped in a blanket I had set aside, the letters in a small box that I kept within reach. The quilt rode on my lap. I appreciated the way men who move things for a living keep a working silence that is never cold. While they carried, I filed a change of address with the Postal Service and sent a brief note to the firm with my new mailing details so their records would be exact. I printed 2 copies for the lockbox and the safe deposit drawer. The printer coughed once and then obeyed. I wrote a short line in my notebook with time so memory would not be forced to perform later. Movers arrived. Keys to lockbox after final walkthrough. Chair loaded. Album packed. Address updated. When the rooms went quiet, the den looked like a picture after the subject has been carefully erased. I wiped the arms of the empty space where the chair had stood as a way to let my hands say goodbye. At the back door, I placed the keys in the lockbox, set the code, and spun the dial. The spare set went into an envelope for Kelly and slid into the drop slot we had agreed on. I checked the windows, pressed the front door closed, and waited for the latch to catch. I did not turn the key again. Outside, a kid on the next block dribbled a basketball and a dog barked twice, then gave up. The air smelled like cut grass and dust. I got in my car and followed the truck toward a place that would carry my name differently. Willow Ridge sits back from the street behind a row of live oaks. The drive curves in a way that makes you slow without a sign telling you to. Light caught the entrance glass and gave it back softly. Inside, the air smelled like lemons and something faintly sweet. A low wash of jazz moved from a speaker I could not see. The woman at the desk looked up and said my name without asking for it. Dana Walsh from the community team stepped forward with a welcome that had the shape of practice and the feel of care. We walked down a wide hallway where the carpet kept footfalls to itself. On the right, a small library held two men trading clues over a crossword. On the left, a long table stood ready for what looked like watercolors. Dana said my unit was ready and that the corner windows faced the courtyard garden. The door opened to a square room full of honest light. A small kitchenette, a closet with tidy shelves, enough space for a chair to claim the window as its own. The movers set Arthur's chair where the light fell cleanly in the afternoon. I asked for an inch of angle toward the glass, and the foreman smiled and nudged it just so. The album went on the short built-in shelf by the bed. The navy cap took the hook near the door like it had always belonged there. The book stood in a modest line, a little spine of company. The quilt folded over the foot of the bed and turned sharp white into home. Dana reviewed the last pages of the packet. Mealtimes, laundry arrangements, garden hours, the emergency pull cords I hoped never to touch. She handed me a key card and a fob for the side door near parking and said the dining room expected me this evening. She said there would be a card with my name on a chair, so I would not have to look for a place to land. My jaw loosened without my permission. I told her thank you and meant it. As Dana stepped into the hall, a woman paused at the doorway and smiled with something warmer than politeness. She introduced herself as Helen Brooks and said she had a spot saved at the table by the window. She added that they liked to hear news stories at dinner, but that listening counted as a story if that was what I needed. I said I would be there. Her eyes said good, and she moved on with a small wave. When the movers left the room, held a gentle quiet that did not accuse me of anything. I set a small candle on the dresser and lit it. The flame caught and steadied. I opened my journal and wrote a single line that felt like a hand on my shoulder. Arrived and present. I closed the book so the sentence would not try to grow into a speech. I sat in Arthur's chair and let the fabric learn my weight in a new corner. Outside, a crepe myrtle stood with thin branches and stubborn buds. A woman crossed the courtyard path with a walker trimmed in blue and lifted her hand without slowing. I answered with the same small motion. The time between here and dinner felt wide enough for breath and narrow enough to keep me from wandering. I stood and straightened the quilt so the squares lay even. I set the key card on a small dish by the door and tucked the spare into my wallet. The smell of lemons reached me again, and the saxophone slid into a new line. My name would be on a chair. I pinched the candle wick and watched a thread of smoke lift and thin. Then I opened the door and stepped into the hallway where voices moved toward light, ready to learn the sound of my name in a room that expected it. In early April, Pastor Leon Carter set a box of pamphlets on the lounge table at Willow Ridge and told us about a small therapeutic garden for women living with memory loss. Volunteers and tools were ready. What they lacked was a simple patch of ground near town that would not drown them in rent or red tape. I felt a door open in my mind. There was a half-acre I owned on the edge of McKinney separate from the duplex in town. Wild rye in spring, sunflowers that refused to quit. I told Pastor Leon I might have an answer and that I would call my attorney to do it the right way. JR returned my call before lunch and met me the next morning with a printout map and a legal pad. The parcel was titled in my name and free of liens. He said a lifetime grant of use would fit if we were precise. We would use a quick claim deed to give Elder Harbor the right to use and improve that half-acre as a therapeutic garden, and we would put conditions in plain words. Non-commercial use only, hours respectful of neighbors, maintenance and liability insurance carried by the program, obedience to city code, no permanent buildings beyond sheds and beds without written consent, reversion of use if the nonprofit ceased or if the ground sat idle for a full year. We would record the deed with the county. Originals would sit in the firm vault, and a certified copy would go to my safe deposit box. A password-protected scan would live in the secure folder Nina had set up. We drove to the site with Pastor Leon that afternoon. Pecan trees held a long sky. An old gate gave way when J.R. lifted the tired chain. Pastor paced the sun path and pointed where shade would fall by 2:00 in July. A hose bib could be added at the frontage. Parking on work days could tuck under the trees without blocking anyone. He talked about raised beds at a height that welcomes tired knees, benches along shade lines, herbs that carry memory through scent when names slip away. Rosemary, basil, lemon balm. Back at the office, Nina drafted the deed while J.R. called Elder Harbor for board approval and a contact name. The stack came together clean. Legal description by metes and bounds. Grant of use and improvement rights for a therapeutic garden that serves older adults and those with memory challenges. Conditions of use. Insurance naming me as additional insured. Duty to maintain fencing and manage runoff. No sale or lease. Reversion if the program lapses for 12 months. A simple request for a wooden sign to thank the partner so volunteers would know whose ground they tended. J.R. asked whether I wanted a reserved bed. I told him I preferred to be just another set of hands on volunteer days. I signed in front of a notary. The seal caught the page with that small sound that means a thing is real. Nina prepared certified copies. J.R. stapled a check to the recording form, and we carried the papers to the county clerk in McKinney. A clerk in a gray cardigan stamped book and page and handed back the marked copy. She said the image would be online by morning. At the bank, I slid the certified copy into my box beside the will and the backup codes. The drawer swallowed the paper, and that felt right. 2 days later, Elder Harbor wrote that their board vote had passed and that a build day was set for Saturday. Pastor Leon asked if I wanted to say a few words to bless the ground. I told him I would rather carry a rake. The morning broke clear and cool. Trucks eased under the pecans. Someone brought a post-hole digger and a bed of compost and a coil of hose. Cedar boards gave the air the smell of old drawers. A young woman named Anya from a partner group arrived with laminated plant cards and a small packet of vinyl letters. She said her grandmother gardened in Krakow, and she wanted the sign to carry the words she loved for thanks. She held up the letters. Jackie. We all tried the sound and smiled. We set the first bed square with the fence. I carried boards and held a level while 2 men drove screws with a rhythm that made talking needless. The sun rose, and a line of sweat settled along my hair. It felt good to work. Teenagers shoveled compost into wheelbarrows. An older woman in a denim shirt sat on a crate and stripped rosemary sprigs so we could rub the oils on our fingers and carry the scent as a thread back to ourselves. The water crew clicked the hose into a simple manifold, and when the spigot turned, the lines shuddered and then drank. By midday, 3 beds stood true and a 4th waited for leveling. We set a bench in the shade and screwed a small plaque into the back slat with the garden name and the partner. Anya pressed the vinyl letters on a pine board. Therapeutic Garden, Jakey Elder Harbor. The simple word looked like a ribbon across the grain. Someone lifted a hammer and the sound rang bright as the sign took its post. The program lead handed me a photocopy of their insurance certificate, with my name listed as required and a receipt for materials. She said they would file monthly notes with Elder Harbor and send me a simple quarterly update, so I would know this ground kept its promise. We ate sandwiches standing in the shade and drank lemonade that tasted better for the dirt on our wrists. Pastor Leon spoke a few steady sentences and thanked the people who showed up and the ones who would come next week to plant. When the crew returned to work, I walked the new edges and set my hand into the soil, warm at the top, cool below. I thought of shelling peas at my grandmother's table with the radio humming and the afternoon unafraid to be slow. I did not make a speech. I told the ground in a voice only I could hear that I was planting what I believed. Use is a kind of love. Let this plot answer to hands and names beyond mine. I pressed my palm flat and lifted it again and left a small print that the sun would erase and the water would soften. By late day, the cedar turned honey and the tools went back into trucks. People promised to return next Saturday and waved with the good tired that comes from work that means something. Pastor and I closed the gate with a new chain and a simple lock. He said the land looked like it had been waiting. I agreed. Back at Willow Ridge, I washed my hands until the water ran clear and set the stamped copy of the deed on my desk to dry where the sun touched the paper. I sat in Arthur's chair and watched the courtyard lights come on in a slow line. A small piece of ground and a small piece of me had learned a purpose. That was enough for the day. On the 15th of September, I woke to an email from Samuel Price with a calm subject line that mentioned certified mail notices sent this morning. He listed the tracking numbers in the body in tidy rows with expected delivery windows. One for Ben at his address in Frisco, one for Lena at the same, one for their household email that would mirror the paper notice, one copy for my file at the firm. He wrote that the letters contained formal notice of the updated will and the beneficiary changes and that return receipts had been requested. He would monitor delivery and forward proof as each card came back. I read the numbers twice and copied them into my notebook under a heading I had used all summer for receipts. By mid-morning, the tracking page showed a scan with the words accepted at counter. A green strip in my memory matched the form I had seen before when Arthur mailed important papers. It felt like a small machine had engaged and would not stop because someone yelled at it. I set the kettle for tea and sat in Arthur's chair with the tablet balanced on my knee while the sun worked across the courtyard. The garden team would meet this weekend to set fall greens and garlic. For now the beds rested under straw that glowed like old gold. Just after noon, my phone began to register missed calls. The first came while I was rinsing a cup. The second arrived when I set the cup down. By the fourth, I turned the phone face down and let it vibrate against the wood like a trapped bee. A brief pause followed, and then 3 more in a row. The call log stacked the entries with time stamps like fence posts. I counted them in my head and wrote the count in my notebook and the time. 6. Then 9. The building hummed with its ordinary rhythm. A laundry cart rolled somewhere down the hall. Someone laughed softly near the elevator and the sound faded. Near 2:00, a scan on the tracking page changed from in transit to out for delivery. I watched the blue bar inch forward as if it were a weather map. I turned the tablet to dark and rested my eyes. When I opened them again, the status had shifted to delivered. A minute later, Samuel forwarded the first automated confirmation. Return receipt service in effect. Confirmation pending. He added no commentary. He did not need to. The point of paper is that it speaks without heat. By 4 in the afternoon, the count on my call log reached 11. I kept my hands on my lap and did not pick up. I had already told Samuel that I would not engage by phone if they reached out, and he had agreed that silence was the cleanest course. My job was to keep records and protect the quiet I had made. At 5, I walked down to the dining room, and Helen waved from the table by the window where she keeps a crossword folded under her napkin. She asked if I wanted chicken or fish. We talked about the puzzle and the way the new teacher in the watercolor class had a habit of stapling handouts in the upper right corner instead of the left. I kept my phone in my bag. When I returned to my room, there were 5 more missed calls and a long message from the carrier. Address that must have been the garden site for administrative meetings. A program lead had signed for on my behalf as the deed allowed. Samuel forwarded the photo the postal carrier took with the package in frame like a small portrait. I saved it to the receipts folder and wrote a line in my notebook with the time. At 8, my inbox lit with a new message from Ben. The subject line read, "I am sorry, Mom, but at least let us keep the garden." I did not open it. I watched the line sit there under the new mail banner. Words began to write themselves in my imagination without permission. I closed the mail app and let the screen go blank. I stood and crossed to the window and looked down into the courtyard where the pathway lights had begun to string themselves into a patient river. I felt my breath move out and in with no hitch. The phone buzzed again. A text from the Homeowners Association president from the old neighborhood, Marjorie Ellis, who has always favored tidy lines and rules written without loopholes. She had sent a screenshot from the neighborhood social group. Names were familiar. A chain of comments flared about a mother who had cut off her family and about how some people forget who changed their tires in high school. One post used a word that aimed to hurt without saying it outright. Marjorie added a short note that said she did not know what was true but thought I should be aware of the chatter in case it reached me in worse ways later. She signed with her initials the way she does when she wants to be formal. I looked at the screenshot long enough to understand the shape of it, and then I deleted it from the screen without saving it. I am not a flame that needs that kind of air. I sent Marjorie a single line that thanked her for the heads up and asked her not to engage on my behalf. She replied with a thumbs up icon that she must use for other messages, and then a second line that said she was sorry for any noise. I put the phone down. Samuel called at 9 from his office number and left a voicemail that said delivery had been confirmed at both addresses and that return receipts were in process. He would send scanned copies when the cards came back with signatures. He reminded me that no response was a valid response and that any communication should come through counsel if it came at all. He kept his voice free of emotion on purpose, and I appreciated that discipline on a day when other people used too many words. At 10, I washed my face and changed into a soft shirt and set the tablet to charge. I looked at the email subject line one more time and felt the old habit to answer rise like a reflex. I let it pass. Sometimes silence is not a wound. Sometimes it is a boundary with a lock you installed yourself. I turned the phone to do not disturb and placed it face down on the dresser next to the small dish that holds my key card and the spare change that accumulates from the cafe when I forget my wallet. Sleep came in fragments. Around midnight, I woke and poured water from the glass and stood at the window again. The courtyard had emptied of movement. A light over the service door drew a circle on the concrete, and within it a single moth worked a long errand. I thought of the garden plot at the edge of town and the raised beds waiting for fall greens. I thought of garlic cloves set point up and the way they swell underground without boasting. I thought of the deed in the bank box and the will beside it and the certified letters traveling through the postal system like small trains with clear destinations. In the morning, I made coffee and sat with my notebook. I totaled the calls from the last 24 hours, 16. I wrote the count and the time and left a space for the return receipt cards. I did not open the message from Ben. I did not open the neighborhood app. I sent a short email to Samuel that confirmed receipt of his updates and thanked him for the clean process. I wrote to the program lead at Elder Harbor to ask whether the garden team needed more straw for the beds, and she replied within an hour with a smile in her words and a list from the hardware store. By noon, the building settled into its normal sound. Someone pushed a cart of books toward the lounge. The mail came in a neat hand with 3 items, and none of them heavy. In the afternoon, I would meet Helen by the plant wall to trade paperbacks. The fall sun warmed the window glass and then lessened. My phone sat quiet by choice. The boundary held. I turned the page in my notebook and left it blank for the next line I would write when the cards came back with signatures in blue ink and dates that matched the tracking page. For now, stillness was the whole task, and I kept it. Back in May, before any envelopes or tracking numbers, I was learning how to let a day pass without rescuing anyone. The calendar had a small heart penciled on the second Sunday. I walked the courtyard early and came back to a message from Ben that read like an errand on a sticky note, asking who was cooking dinner. I let it sit unopened on the lock screen. I made toast and buttered it to the edges the way Arthur liked watered the basil on my sill, and wrote one line in my notebook that said, "My love is not a task." Pastor Leon held a quiet service that afternoon for anyone who wanted a place to sit with feeling. I chose a chair near the back and let the sound do its work. He asked later if I needed to talk. I told him listening was enough for that day. That night I slept through until morning and woke with the kind of empty head that is not loss, but rest. June found its rhythm. The garden crew added 2 raised beds and set marigolds in a bright border. I kept my receipts habit. If a worry scratched, I wrote the date and 1 sentence and closed the book. At the plot on the edge of town, a woman who struggles to call names by name ran her fingers along rosemary and said the words her hands remembered: pinch rub, breathe. She smiled when the scent rose and said, there it is, as if she had been looking for a friend in a crowd and found her. At Willow Ridge, the weeks stacked without drama. Helen coaxed me into watercolors, and I surprised myself by painting a chair by a window that looked exactly like mine. The instructor stapled the handouts in the upper right corner again, and I did not tease her this time. I took 2 copies and used the extra to practice shading where I had gone muddy. July came with flags on toothpicks and a notice for a picnic on the lawn. For years, I had watched fireworks while counting sunscreen bottles and car seats and the timing of traffic leaving the lot. I signed my name for the picnic and brought peaches instead of a list. We spread blankets under the live oaks. Someone played an old song and a nurse taught a small step that made even the quiet men smile. At dusk, the sky lifted and bloomed, and no one asked me to hold a camera. I clapped like a child and felt ease move through my ribs uncharged by anyone else. Early that month, a school message landed in my inbox, a mass invitation for Grandparents' Day in September. The email came from a general address with many names in the header. I read the details, then replied in plain words that all communication for those students should go through their parents under school policy and wished them a smooth event. I filed a copy in the folder I keep for school items and did not mark the date on my calendar. Boundaries look like manners when you write them down. Later that week, Helen asked on the long loop past the pond if I ever second-guessed the lines I was drawing. I told her I did have regret, but not the kind that asks for erasing. I regret not doing it sooner. She nodded and let the answer stand. A boy rode past, pedaling with no hands for a few yards, and his laugh lifted the geese from the water in one startle that made us clap without thinking. It felt good to applaud a stranger and mean it. The heat settled the way Texas heat does, thick as a chore. The building stayed cool and busy. On Saturdays, I brought a jug of water and a sack of ice to the garden and tucked garlic cloves point up like small sails. At home, I kept my phone on the dresser and my notebook open to a page that held 3 lines. Keep silence to keep peace. Speak to counsel, not to hurt. Do not let sadness turn into theater. The page did not need more ink than that. A Sunday at the market gave me a small test. A woman from the old neighborhood rolled her cart beside mine and asked how I was in the voice that wants a story with sparks. I told her I was well and that the peaches were worth the trip. She laughed and said I always did keep a secret. I smiled and paid for fruit and walked out into heat that felt honest. By the end of July, the sign at the garden took its place near the gate. The letters Ania pressed onto the pine held tight through a short rain. The simple word for thanks from her childhood sat easy in Texas light. Pastor Leon and I watched a woman trace the letters with one finger and hear the sound without needing to own the language. The program lead carried a clipboard with a plan for fall greens and asked for a little more straw to keep the soil from baking. I told her I would bring it next week and wrote it on a small card, so I would not pretend to remember without help. August became the month of checking locks. I sharpened 2 pencils and made a clean list. Beneficiary forms aligned with the will. Deed recorded and copy in the box. Contact list trimmed to essential names. Secure email tested and working. Keys in their 2 places. I wrote each item and checked it only when proof sat in front of me. The list shortened, and my breath did not have to lift so hard. On the last evening of the month, I sat in Arthur's chair and looked at September's first week. The squares were mostly white. I wrote the word stillness in the corner as if I could attend it like a class. The next morning, Helen saved me a seat by the window and slid her crossword across. One clue asked for a firm decision. We filled boxes until the word appeared and fit without forcing. It felt like a small ribbon tied around months of quiet labor. I folded the page and tucked it under my napkin, and we walked our plates to the line together. All of that lived just beneath the surface when the formal notices began their route later in September. The months had not made me harder. They had made my edges true. When people sent short messages shaped like assignments, I did not take them. When institutions wrote invitations as if obligation were the same as affection, I answered with policy and wished them well. When friends asked if I ached, I told them the truth in a sentence and did not perform. A boundary is not a wall when you can still see the garden through it. It is a fence with a good latch that keeps what needs keeping and lets you open it on purpose. By the end of the week, I cleared the small table by the window and set out what I would need. The notebook on my left, the laptop in front of me, the firm envelope on my right. Morning light pooled across the wood like a clean page. The task was simple. Gather what happened, label it, store it where time could not smudge it. I began with the image that marked the airport day in a way no one could explain away. The story square from Lena with the location tag at Dallas-Fort Worth and the little badge that said priority and first class beside a plastic cup. I pulled it from cloud storage, saved an untouched original, then made a working copy. In the notes field, I recorded date and hour and where I had been standing when I captured it. I placed both versions in a new folder and wrote a matching line in my notebook. Next came the email that arrived the day the certified letters went out, the one with a subject that tried to apologize and then asked to keep the garden. I did not open the body. I printed the header and the technical page that shows the path a message takes. Timestamps and servers lined up like a spine. The paper slid warm into a clear sleeve and joined the growing stack. From the bank portal, I downloaded the confirmation that the school district autopay had been canceled. The reference number sat near the top. I printed it, then wrote date and hour by hand at the bottom margin. I exported the log that shows when my password changed and when two-factor was enabled with the device list that now held only my phone and my laptop. I saved the file and added it to the folder. I opened my call log and copied the count for the 24 hours after the letters were accepted at the counter. 16 missed calls. No commentary. Numbers can stand on their own if you let them. I closed the phone and set it out of reach. A secure note arrived from Nina with a short plan written in plain steps. Keep a master index at the top of the folder that lists every item with one line for description, source, and date. Use a simple file name rule so items sort themselves: year, then month, then day, then a brief tag. Store originals separate from working copies, so there is never a doubt what was touched. Keep a certified paper copy for any digital proof that matters and place it somewhere beyond your apartment. I thanked her and began the index. Carla called from her office to confirm that my profile changes had held and that two-factor was firing every time. Alerts were in place for large withdrawals and profile edits. The safe deposit inventory now reflected the certified copy of the garden deed I had added last week. Bring the paper list of backup codes next visit so we can scan to your profile, she said, and keep the original in the drawer. I wrote the errand on a card I keep by the door. I paused and looked at what I had made so far. The airport image with place and time. The garden email subject preserved with its technical path. The bank confirmation for the canceled payment. Security logs, the call count. Each line matched by date. I named the main folder in a way I would always remember. Receipts, 2025 heart. At the top of the index, I typed a sentence I wanted to see each time I opened it. Facts in order, keep air clear. For anyone who finds themselves in a similar tangle, this is only information I learned, not legal advice. Keep a dated log on paper and do not trust memory without ink. Speak with an estate attorney before you act so your steps come in the right order. Align beneficiary forms and payable on death and transfer on death registrations with your will so papers do not argue with each other. Reset passwords and enable two-factor on accounts where you keep money or important messages and store backup codes away from your devices. Place original documents in a bank-safe deposit box, keep certified copies at home, and maintain a secure digital backup for the parts that can travel. It fits on one side of a card, and it is enough. I returned to the work. I scanned the clerk stamps that showed the garden deed recorded book and page printed in black. I dropped a digital copy into the folder and checked the box on the index. I added delivery confirmations from the Postal Service, each with tracking number and the moment a carrier marked delivered. I did not add adjectives. The lines already carried weight. Nina followed with one more caution. Do not annotate or resize original screenshots. Make a separate marked copy if you must highlight and note in the index what you did. Keep a steady scan resolution so each page is legible and light. I followed her rule. I placed a small red dot on a working copy of the airport image near the location tag and recorded that edit in the index. The untouched file stayed clean. By early afternoon, the table had taken on the shape of a timeline. I could start at the top left and move to the bottom right and hold the story without saying a word. That was the point. I did not need a speech. I needed a record that could stand when I was not in the room. I took a small encrypted drive from the drawer and connected it. The device woke and asked for the passcode I keep written once and tucked away from here. I entered it and watched the light glow. I copied the receipts folder and the master index and waited while the bar moved steady. When it finished, I ejected the drive and heard a neat click that sounded like a clasp. I slipped it into a small cloth pouch and set it on the tray with my keys so it would travel with me to the bank box. I printed the master index and slid it behind the sleeve that held the email headers. I placed the set in a flat folder with Brad's and labeled the spine with my name and the year. The folder stood upright on the small shelf next to the watercolor handouts, where it would look like any other set of papers. Ordinary is safer than special when the goal is to be left alone. The sun shifted across the courtyard and turned the path a softer color. I made tea and let the cup sit in my hands long enough to cool from hot to warm. I did not reopen anything I had already filed. I wrote a closing line in the notebook that matched the work. Evidence gathered labeled stored. A light tap sounded at the door, and Helen said my name through it as if she were trying to keep a bird from flying off. I told her I would be right there. Before I left, I placed the cloth pouch on top of my wallet so the bank errand would not slip to tomorrow. I closed the laptop, capped my pen, and squared the stack until the corners agreed. In the hallway, the plant wall breathed a clean green scent. I touched a leaf without pinching, and the smell rose anyway. A cart hummed somewhere near the lounge. Someone laughed. I let the door close behind me and walked toward the window table where Helen would already have a chair with my name in her head and a crossword folded under her napkin. The folder on my shelf stood quiet and paid no attention to the room, which is exactly what I wanted from it. Late September brought a clear morning over the edge of McKinney as I turned into the gravel pullout by the pecans. The gate stood open and the beds looked settled as if the ground had been waiting for this shape. Volunteers set orange cones along the shoulder. A city inspector in a blue shirt walked the path with a clipboard, tested the shutoff valve, checked fence lines, pressed a boot into the mulched aisles, and said compliant in a voice that made me trust her eyes. The program lead from Elder Harbor thanked the inspector and waved in the small crowd. Pastor Leon stood near the bench with his hands in his pockets and a smile that felt like a deep breath. Dana from Willow Ridge arrived with 2 staff and a basket that smelled like cinnamon. She squeezed my arm and said a gift made during life pulls the future closer than a promise ever can. I thought of the deed locked in the bank drawer and nodded. Near the center bed, a steel plaque waited on a short post brushed to a soft shine so the letters sat quiet. Therapeutic Garden on the first line. A sentence thanking Elder Harbor and the many hands that would tend this place. Near the bottom, my name Evelyn Hart placed without fuss. I laid my fingers on the cool metal long enough to feel the work that paper had become, and then stepped aside. This day was for use, not ownership. Families drifted toward the herb bed. A small woman in a sky-colored sweater reached for basil, pinched a leaf rubbed once, lifted her fingers, and closed her eyes. She said that this smell is home. Her daughter laughed with a wet sound and said she had worried her mother would not know the plants. The mother patted her hand and said that hands remember what minds sometimes put down. I felt something loosen under my ribs. The program lead kept the remarks short. She noted the safety checks completed, thanked the city staff, the partners, and the volunteers, and pointed to the tub of seedlings waiting. Pastor Leon added a few steady words and thanked the ground for letting us try. I had been asked to say something. I set a palm on the post and told the group that not everything we plant will live, but what lives will belong to us in the best way, not as property, but as proof that care can take root. Failure here becomes compost, not shame. The work is the point. I stepped back because seedlings do not wait on speeches. We opened trays, and the air filled with the green smell that makes people brave. Children carried 6 packs of lettuce with solemn faces. Teenagers set garlic cloves point up and pressed them into the cool earth. A pair of nurses eased gloves onto stiff hands and guided a trowel to a soft corner. The water crew turned the valve slowly, and the line gave a soft hiss as the soil darkened to a richer brown. A photographer from a community page took pictures of hands and tools and the corner of the plaque. He asked for names and wrote them small. Later, a photo of a laughing boy with dirt on his chin and a slice of the steel plate would appear online. I saw it on my phone and set the screen down. In some other room, I could imagine Ben and Lena seeing the same frame and choosing silence. I let that thought pass without chasing its tail. Dana spoke with the program lead about a weekly visit from Willow Ridge, once the weather held a van, a staff helper, a short list of safe tasks. She said again that a donation made now had shortened the distance between idea and open gate. I could hear Arthur in my head saying that time is a tool, and using it is not cold, it is kind. We ate simple sandwiches in the shade and drank water from a cooler with the lid dented in. Anya arrived with seed packets and pressed out radish and arugula, so early winds would lift spirits. The inspector returned with one more form for the file and a handshake that felt like approval rather than escape. A city truck dropped a load of mulch with a friendly nod and rolled off in a puff of dust. As the crowd thinned, a man with a cane took a slow lap and stopped at the rosemary. He broke a tiny sprig, rolled it between finger and thumb, and smiled as the scent rose. He told me his mother kept a sprig by the stove for luck, and that when he left for basic, she put one in his pocket and told him to keep his head straight. He tucked the sliver into his wallet and tapped it twice, as if to set the memory. The program lead asked for a quick photo by the sign for their newsletter and grant file. I stood for one and then waved her back to the beds where the lenses belonged. We coiled hoses, stacked empty trays, and tied the trash bag in a neat knot. Pastor Leon looped the chain through the gate in a way that would not frustrate the next crew. The light fell at an angle that warmed the cedar to honey. On the drive back to Willow Ridge, the photo from the community page had gathered a small scatter of kind words. I did not read past the first line. At the entrance, the evening staff held the door while a resident steered a walker with tennis balls on the feet. The building smelled of lemons and supper. In my room, the folder on the shelf sat exactly where I had left it, quiet and useful. I sat in Arthur's chair and let my hands rest. A woman had found her kitchen in a basil leaf. A man had found his mother in a sprig of rosemary. The plaque thanked without shouting. The beds were planted. Justice had learned a patient shape. I looked out at the courtyard lights coming on one by one and felt the sentence Arthur liked to use when talk had finally become work. That will hold. The first week of October settled in with a thin, bright light on the oaks outside Willow Ridge. Early Monday, Samuel sent a brief email and an audio file. He had called Ben and left a voicemail that did one job. He restated the process set in the certified letters from September 15th, that all responses must go through the law office, that direct contact with me would not be answered, that further communication would be logged. His voice was steady and cool as a level on a board. I saved the file to Receipts 2025 Hart and wrote the time in my notebook. Lunch with Helen was ordinary in the good way. She tamed a stubborn crossword square and slid a peach slice onto my plate. After a slow walk, I came back to my room and saw a call from a number I knew too well. I let it finish ringing on its own. A minute later, the concierge rang my room. She said a man named Ben Hart had driven into the front lot and asked to see me. Her tone did not push or lean. It simply set the fact down. I asked if security was with him. She said yes, Mr. Alvarez was already outside and had explained visitor rules and the resident right to decline. I asked her to deliver a message as written. I would not meet today or on any day without counsel present. All matters must go through the executor Samuel Price, as referenced in the notice of September 15th. Please thank him for coming and wish him a safe drive home. She repeated the words back exactly. I could hear that they would hold. I took a memoir to the library rather than sit in my room counting footsteps I would not hear. The windows there keep a soft light across the tables. I found my place near the end and let the line of the paragraph gather me. A set of steps passed the doorway, paused and moved on. The quiet felt earned. 10 minutes later, the concierge appeared and kept her voice low. She said Mr. Hart had been given my message and that Mr. Alvarez was walking him back to the lot. There were no raised voices. He had asked if I would accept a written note. I asked that any note be mailed to my attorney so it would land in the right hands. She nodded and withdrew. I read the next page and let the book do its work. Samuel texted next. He had received a call from the desk confirming the visit. He would send a short letter to Ben, noting that an in-person approach at my residence was not appropriate and that any future attempt would be referred to building security and, if needed, local police as a wellness and safety matter. He asked me to correct anything he had wrong. I replied that his summary was exact. In my mind, I could see the angle Ben keeps on a steering wheel and the way his jaw sets when told no. I did not write speeches inside my skull. My job was to keep air clear. I listened instead to the building's small music. The hum by the elevator, a light clatter from the craft room, the cart that squeaks once at the turn. When I looked back down, the sentence on the page waited where I had left it. On my way for tea, I saw Mr. Alvarez come in from the lot. He gave a nod that said finished without news. I nodded back. In the dining room, Helen lifted 2 fingers from the window table, our signal when one of us might need a rescue. I raised my palm to say all is well and watched her let the matter drift away like lint. I took the long route back to my room and stopped at the bulletin board. Next week, the watercolor lesson would be chairs and light. The handouts would be stapled in the upper right corner, and the thought made me smile. At my desk, I added 2 lines to the day's entry. Executor voicemail to Ben logged. Visit at residence declined through front desk and routed to counsel. The pen left a clean period that felt like a latch catching. The message light blinked on my phone. I put it on speaker and listened once to Samuel's voice to Ben. He named the firm, cited the letter by date, set the rule ended without invitation. I deleted the system copy. The saved file sat where it belonged in the folder with other proofs. What I might need later is not the same as what I wish to replay. Near 5, the concierge called again to confirm the visitor had left the property without incident and to ask whether my profile should note that any approach by that individual triggers a call to the desk and no transfers to my room. "Yes, please," I said, "and thank you for asking it clearly." She added the note and wished me a quiet evening. I returned to the library and finished the memoir. The last pages folded around a decision that looked like mine in another decade. The author wrote of stopping the habit of arguing with ghosts not because they were wrong, but because they were finished. I read the final line twice and closed the cover with my palm laid flat. Paper settled against paper. No applause, only the small sound of a book going to sleep. At the doorway, a neighbor paused and said a place was saved for me by the window at 6. I told her I would be there. The sentence warmed a small corner under my ribs. On the way down the hall, I passed Dana. She asked with the care of a person who has stood between storms whether all was all right. I told her the process worked as designed and thanked her for a team that speaks in calm sentences. She smiled with the look of work well done. In my room, I washed my hands and looked at the small watercolor of a chair near a window. It is not good, and it does not need to be. It reminds me that sitting still can be an act, and not a surrender. The phone lay face down on the dresser on Do Not Disturb. I slipped my keycard into a pocket and turned off the lamp. The plant wall in the corridor breathed a faint trace of basil as someone passed. At the desk, a small light made a pool on polished wood. Beyond it, Mr. Alvarez studied the parking feed with the easy attention of a guard watching peace to keep it. The dining room hummed. Helen laid her napkin over the chair beside her as a small flag. I took the seat, felt the chair accept my weight, and let the room carry on. No stage, no argument, only the steady business of a life that had learned its edges and kept them. The dining room at Willow Ridge hummed the way it does when soup is hot and friends have found each other. I was halfway to the window table when I heard my full name spoken clearly through the tangle of voices. I turned and saw the activities coordinator with her hand lifted in an easy wave. She said people had been sharing small lessons at dinner and would I offer one of my own. Chairs scooted in a loose circle. Helen patted the seat beside her as if it had always been mine. I did not rehearse. I looked at the faces that had fed me stories all summer and let the words settle into their simple shapes. I said that this year taught me how to draw a line and keep it without cruelty. That silence can speak when it is chosen not as a weapon, but as a fence with a good latch. That family is not the list you inherit, but the people who show up and stay when there is nothing to win. I added that kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It is a leak. And when you stop the leak, you do not become smaller. You become clear. Someone set a cup of tea in front of me and the circle loosened back into a room. A man who loves riddles raised his fork and said that sounded like a secret map. The table laughed in that gentle way we have learned together. A new resident asked if I was angry most days. I told her no. Anger is loud and expensive. I have chosen something quieter that lasts longer. She nodded as if she recognized a road sign. Dinner moved on. Baked chicken and green beans with more butter than a dietitian would prefer. Helen slid me a crust of bread and said, "Next week we should switch seats and see if the view feels different." I told her I might be brave enough for that. Dana crossed the room and touched my shoulder the quick check that staff learn from practice. I told her everything was in its place. She smiled and disappeared behind a tray of coffee cups. When plates were cleared, we lingered a few minutes the way people do who are not racing back to anything. The talk turned to small things. The crossword that refused to surrender a 4-letter word for firm decision until we bullied it. The young volunteer who plays piano on Thursdays and never repeats a song. The plant wall that smells like basil even when you do not touch it. After a while, we rose without ceremony and drifted down the hall in pairs and threes. I felt the pleasant heaviness of a day that had held its shape without effort. In my room, I set the key card in its dish and stood for a moment at the window. The courtyard lights had already traced their soft path. Somewhere a cartwheel gave its single squeak around the turn. I took out the small candle that lives in the dresser and set it on the dish with a shallow saucer under it. The match caught, flared, and steadied. I sat in Arthur's chair and let the flame draw my eyes until my breath matched its slow reach and fall. I told him about the garden opening and the rosemary in a wallet, and the woman who found her kitchen in a basil leaf. I told him we were all right. Not perfect, not spare. All right. On the desk, my notebook lay open to a nearly full year. Lines of dates and small sentences neat enough to be read by a stranger and kind enough to be read by me. I picked up the pen and turned to the back where I leave the last page for a single line that matters more than all the others. The words arrived without scraping. I wrote that I had crossed them out of my will and written my own name back into my life. The pen left a period that looked like a door pulled to with care. I closed the notebook and slid the elastic around the cover. There was no applause, only the small sound of paper resting against paper. I turned to the window again. The night beyond the glass was a patient dark. My phone lay face down with the setting that keeps it quiet. Somewhere in the building, a laugh rose and faded. I thought about the way people had said my name at dinner and how it had landed in the center of the circle like a small stone dropped into a full lake. It was more gentle. Reached the legs and returned without noise. I stood and pinched the candle. A thin thread of smoke climbed and unraveled. The room held its own warmth for a breath longer. In that calm, I let my voice settle into the story one last time, the way a narrator speaks at the end when the camera has pulled back and the music has lowered to a ribbon. If you believe that clean justice for older adults matters, if you have made it this far and felt the shape of a boundary turn into peace type, the word justice, so others know they are not alone. Stay with me for the next piece where I will share a simple 3-step guide to updating beneficiary and payable on death and transfer on death designations offered as information only and never as legal advice. I set the spent match in the saucer and watched the last curl of smoke vanish. The chair at the window welcomed me back as if it had kept my place. Outside, a moth worked its quiet errand in the circle of light by the service door. Inside, the air was still and sure. I let the room become dark on purpose and felt the kind of full that does not ask for anything more.